Okay, hey guys, it's Abigail, and I'm making the screencast for chapter 20, and it's probably going to be kind of long because it's 9 pages long, and I'm going to be reading directly from Ashley Royce's notes. Okay, so the Progressive Era. It's from 1900 to 1914, and progressive means that you're going to take action to change things, make progress. The purpose of this area was to clean up all the bad stuff happening in the cities. So, the course of the reform. The progressive mind. The time period before the progressive era was the Industrial Revolution. Ideals of the day during the Industrial Revolution were social Darwinism, laissez-faire, self-made wealth, people working hard to find success, and the government not intervening. Eventually, people realized that there were issues with these ideals, and there were few rich and many poor people. The labor movement was not making much headway with reform in the workplace. People started to refer to the Industrial Revolution as the Gilded Age. Gilded means to give a deceptively attractive appearance. This leads us into the Progressive Era. Widespread reform movement in response to the Industrial Revolution wanted to build better society with government regulation/intervention. Not all progressives agreed on a uniform set of issues. We see different groups fighting for different reforms. Different areas of reform include government and political, moral, labor, and social. So, muckraker is a person who investigates and exposes corruption. Ida Tarbell, a journalist, wrote articles which were later compiled into the book The History of the Standard Oil Company. Exposed the corrupt practices of John Rockefeller and his monopoly. Jacob Riis, he was an immigrant from Denmark, an author and a photographer, and wrote and illustrated How the Other Half Lives about tenement living in New York City. And he exposed poor conditions which immigrants faced. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle and wanted to expose the life of immigrants and issues with capitalism, and he ended up exposing the meatpacking industry instead. Ray Stannard Baker focused on labor and union issues and wrote articles to show the struggle of American workers in the fight against employers. He liked to highlight when troops were used to halt union protests. And then John Spargo focused on child labor and wrote a book called The Bitter Cry of Children. And Lincoln Steffens, and his issue was big city political corruption, and he wanted to show Americans the state of their politics and get them angry about it. And the series of articles later were compiled into a book called The Shame of Cities. Then Thomas Nast was a political cartoon artist who focused on political machines and Southern race issues. So, women progressives. Women still considered the social housekeepers, and they had one job, and they had the job of cleaning up society as well as their houses. This is how they start getting involved in political issues and politics. The term feminism and feminists developed during this time, and these were women who believed that they should be equal to men in all areas of life. They rejected the idea that men and women occupied separate spheres and rejected the idea that women were the weaker sex. One progressive woman was Jane Addams. She founded the Hull House, a settlement house community center for poor neighborhoods, and provided help and information to those who needed it. And it had had childcare, education programs, medical assistance, English lessons for immigrants. And there's many settlement houses popping up in America. The Hull House was just the most famous one. And another progressive woman was Jane. That's not Jane. Okay. Another progressive woman was Margaret Sanger. She was a New York City nurse witnessed a poor immigrant die from a bad abortion and she was influenced to educate the poor on birth control. And her goal was to educate the public, especially the poor, on birth control methods. She gave speeches, created pamphlets, and opened the first birth control center in the U.S., which was illegal and considered obscene at the time. Her clinic was constantly being shut down and reopened. Another goal... Okay, new section. Reforming politics. Another goal of the progressives was to reform politics. Robert LaFollette was a progressive politician and member of the Republican Party. He was the governor of Wisconsin, and he had experienced political machine corruption and was the victim of a political machine. He worked to bring back Republican ideals to politics and reduce the power and influence of political machines. Political reforms. Political reforms aimed at giving the people a greater voice. Direct primary. Voters get to choose candidates for elections rather than the political party leaders. Basically reduce the power and influence of political machine leaders. Initiative. Bills could originate by the public, like a petition, rather than the legislature. Bills were then to be put on a ballot. Referendum. When voters voted directly on a bill. Normally legislatures voted on bills, but this is when the bill actually gets put on a public ballot. Recall. When voters could remove an elected official from office by forcing them into another election before their term was up. They could then replace them with someone else. The 17th Amendment called for direct election of senators. In the Constitution, it was originally written that senators were chosen by their state's legislatures. This amendment allows people to have a greater voice. The Triangle Fire was an example of something that happened. I lost my place. The Triangle Fire was an example of something that happened in one city during this era that led to even more people jumping on the reform bandwagon and realizing that they needed change. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City caught on fire. These are kind of... okay. Most workers, mostly young immigrant women, could not escape and were trapped inside. There were no escape routes and no escape plans. Doors were even locked. Employers wanted to keep workers inside and not allow breaks. Nearly 200 people died jumping out of the building, and others died in the fire. The story was covered in newspapers, and the company was charged with manslaughter. They were acquitted at first, but later found guilty in a civil suit. This had a big effect. New York legislators started to require some legislation on fire hazards, unsafe machines, wages, and working hours for women and children. Even political machine politicians in New York agreed and worked with this legislation. The fire was an in-your-face disaster. Politicians realized changes in factories were needed, and workers should not be subjected to such terrible conditions. They realized their working constituents supported these reforms, and they needed to keep up with the ideas of the time. Urban liberalism, the idea that unions and politicians would work together to improve conditions for workers. The idea of urban liberalism eventually developed This was different from labor movement, where laborers worked for change in the workplace and not the political arena. This idea shifted focus to forcing employers to change with law, not just out of necessity. The labor movement had been struggling. The government was siding with big businesses, strikes were not effective, and many employers could replace striking workers, especially with immigrants. Some unions resisted urban liberalism, favoring their own efforts in the workplace. But they eventually had to admit that legislation of laws was needed for effective change. Between 1910 and 1917, industrial states enacted laws requiring insurance to cover on-the-job accidents, which were common. Workers injured on the job would get compensation, whereas before they got little to no compensation. Racism and reform. Another thing that needed reform was racism/prejudice, especially in the South. The big question was, how could democratic reform and white supremacy exist at the same time? We see a lot of government reforms that gave Americans a greater voice, yet African Americans were being kept from the polls. The two ideas contradict one another. Racism allowed for this. The South wanted all these laws to keep African Americans from voting. Birth of a Nation. This film adds to racism conflict. Silent white supremacist film created in 1915 depicted the KKK as heroes, showed that Reconstruction was a moral battle. It was wild African Americans versus heroic KKK. Popular in the South, and everybody praised it. And in the North, especially to those who had been abolitionists for moral reasons, they thought change was necessary in the South. Booker T. Washington and the Atlanta Compromise. Influential in the progressive movement in the South, he had been an abolitionist, less defiant than other abolitionists. With Atlanta Compromise and his economic ideas, he said it was okay to accept segregation as long as it was equal. He was okay with literacy tests and property requirements as long as they applied to blacks and whites. People labeled him as accommodationalist, believed he needed white allies in order to change the South. They're the ones with the power. Basically, if he was radical, he wouldn't get whites on his side. Advocated industrial training, both manual and agricultural type training, and he told African Americans to work hard and own property. He said their economic success would lead to more rights. Behind the scenes, he worked to end segregation and disenfranchisement. W.E.B. Du Bois in the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement was much different. The people who followed it, including Du Bois, encouraged African American pride and demanded political civil equality and denied African American inferiority. Leaders of this movement, especially Du Bois, were critical of Washington and his accommodationalist methods. Both movements are fighting for the same thing, but they are going about it in different ways and don't agree with each other's methods. The NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. With many fighting for African American rights, we get the creation of this first civil rights organization in 1909. Du Bois was the editor of the NAACP journal, The Crisis, and they demanded equal rights for African Americans in the journal, and it was an interracial organization. Included white reformers, it still does today. Progressivism in the national politics. The making of a progressive president. The U.S.'s first progressive president, Theodore Roosevelt. More boisterous than those before him, and he enjoyed things like boxing. Actually blind in the left eye from a boxing match. Out there. Republican, Spanish-American war hero. Supported progressive reforms. Became president when McKinley was shot 6 months into his term in 1901. Oops. Supported conservation, efforts to protect plants, animals, and natural habitats. Wanted to be sure natural resources were not overused and depleted. Known for expanding power of president. Considered the presidency a bully pulpit from which he could influence the media and shape legislation. For example, he can be seen forcing negotiations between coal miner unions and mine owners to end a massive strike before the winter hit. He did not have the power to do this, but he can influence what other people think. Expanded presidential power by doing so. Regulation in the Marketplace by Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not like the term Teddy, so it made him seem weak. People called him TR, first president to be known by his initials. He wanted to regulate the marketplace. In 1890, during Cleveland's administration, Congress established the Sherman Antitrust Act, and Cleveland never used it, and McKinley never used it, so TR was the first to use it. And this act gave the government the right to break up monopolies and trusts, so businesses could not work to restrain competition or monopolize the market. The president actually got to decide whether or not to prosecute a company. They could decide not to. That negative power is really important. If you are friends and in good with the president, he's not going to prosecute your company. The courts actually made the final decisions on whether or not a company's actions were restraining or monopolizing the market, but it was the president that could bring up the charges. So TR became known as a trust buster. He targeted what he called predatory wealth. Trust is when rival companies work together to reduce competition in the same market, but working together and sharing profits. So TR wanted to get rid of all that. He felt some companies were like predators, trying to eliminate all their competition. TR is not anti-business. He just wanted to ensure healthy economic competition in that no one was being taken advantage of. Interstate Commerce Commission, an example of regulating the marketplace. The ICC, federal agency that regulated interstate trade, was created to ensure fair railroad rates. Didn't have very much power. Its effectiveness was limited. But railroad regulation was strengthened with some other acts. The Elkins Act of 1903, which prohibited discriminatory railroad rates. They could not favor a preferred or powerful customer, and everyone had to pay the same price. And then the Hepburn Railway Act gave the ICC the power to set maximum shipping rates so railroad companies could not take advantage of people. The jungle. We were back to the jungle. It had a big impact on TR. It was supposed to exploit the workers' difficulties, the evils of capitalism, and how socialism was good, but it ended up exploiting the meatpacking industry in the unsanitary conditions. This led to the passage of 2 different acts of Congress after TR read it and it urged for change. The Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. It also led to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA. With the FDA, the federal government would now be inspecting factories and halting the sale of unsafe, contaminated food and medicine. The Square Deal. The Square Deal was the term TR used for his executive plans in the 1904 election. That's kind of funny. I lost my place. For the first time, we see a president label his executive plans. From here on out, almost every other president will do it. It got its name because if big businesses victimized workers, TR would see to it that common people received a square or fair deal. The term ended up describing various progressive reforms sponsored by the Roosevelt administration. This is TR bringing power back to the president and taking control again. The government starts interceding on behalf of the ordinary American, whereas before they are interceding on the side of the big business. Basically, just making sure corporations do not abuse their power. The focus is on regulating big businesses, not necessarily breaking it up. They knew it was inevitable at this time. The fracturing of Republican progressivism. The Republican Party started to divide between the progressive and the conservative Republicans. TR said during his second term that he would not run again for president. He could actually do this since he had only been elected once. The other time he was just fulfilling McKinley's term. I'm sorry if my air conditioning's getting white noise in the background. But TR felt he had already done his 2 terms. William Howard Taft was TR's hand-picked successor, who he wanted to follow in his footsteps. Taft believed in following laws strictly and would not expand the power of the president. In the 1908 election, Taft defeated WJB, who was running for the 3rd time. Well, eventually, Roosevelt and Taft split from each other. Taft approved tariffs, so did conservative Republicans who wanted to protect domestic industry. Progressives saw tariffs as a hindrance to economic competition. So, progressive Republicans like Roosevelt and Democrats were anti-tariff because it hindered free trade and economic competition. The Pinchot-Ballinger affair. Republican Party is already splitting. The Pinchot-Ballinger affair contributes to their final split from each other. Gifford Pinchot, U.S. Chief Forester, made public charges against Richard Ballinger, Secretary of Interior. Charges were for transferring public land in Alaska to private coal interest groups. Charges were nullified by Taft's investigation. Taft then fired Pinchot, who was a conservationalist and friend of Roosevelt, for insubordination. Progressives thought Taft was siding with big business, and they were upset that he fired Roosevelt's friend. Taft found himself in company with the conservatives, so Taft was seen as a traitor to the progressives. So he began backing the CRs. I don't know what that... So he began backing the conservative Republicans. Roosevelt wanted to get back into politics at this point, but did not want to divide the Republican Party. He realized that if he divided it, he would only help the Democrats. So, why did he decide to run again? Remember the Sherman Antitrust Act? During TR's presidency, the U.S. Steel Company took over another company, and TR chose not to prosecute them. Taft chose to prosecute U.S. Steel, and Roosevelt saw this as a slap in the face. So, he ran again when a decision by Taft directly contradicted an earlier decision of his. Roosevelt and Taft were completely split now because of the Pinchot-Ballinger event and Taft's decision to prosecute U.S. Steel. And Roosevelt wants to run against Taft in the next election. The new nationalism. In 1912 election, Roosevelt's new executive plans, the new nationalism, government would be the steward or protector of public welfare. So government would take care of the people work for the best interests. Roosevelt called for federal child labor laws, labor regulation, minimum wage for women, and reducing the power of the courts. And he wanted to have a popular recall for court decisions. The Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt campaigned to be Republican presidential candidate in 1912, but Republican Party chose Taft. So TR created his own party, the Progressive Party, aka the Bull Moose Party. There's a picture, I guess. I don't know if that's we're just gonna look at it. So where did the name come from? TR was getting older, and a reporter asked TR if he thought he was healthy enough to run for president. TR responded, "I'm as fit as a bull moose." The party was progressive, duh, and they campaigned on his platform of new nationalism. But just like TR predicted, this gave Democrats a chance to take the election since Republicans were split. Woodrow Wilson. The other candidate in the 1912 election was Wilson, who was a Democrat. And he looks like Mr. Rogers off of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Okay. His executive plan was New Freedom. Felt America should be free from government control, that it was against American ideals. said that they should have free enterprise. A world without free enterprise would be like slavery. Did not want large corporate companies to abuse with their power, but he did not want to intervene. Realized the federal government would have to intervene. But rather than have direct government intervention, New Freedom called for strict rules for maintaining competition in the economy and would keep large companies from abusing their power. Some examples are the Underwood Tariff of 1913. Basically brought down tariffs. Purpose was to spur economic competition by reducing prices. Democrats had been itching to reduce tariffs for a while now. As soon as Wilson got into office, it's one of the first things that they do. Then, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And the purpose of this was to prevent financial panics and secure American banks. There were 12 reserve banks created, which would monitor the commercial banks and offer funding in case of crisis. Then, the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914. Wilson found it was difficult to define strict rules for companies. He ended up just strengthening the Sherman Act to make it more specific, made certain business practices illegal, still left some definitions of these practices vague, and actions of companies still kind of left open to interpretation. And then they created the new government agency called the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, in 1914. And the purpose was to protect economic competition and therefore consumers. And the FTC will investigate companies for unfair practices that limit competition. Basically, the enforcers of those trust acts, and can order companies to stop certain practices. Wilson in 1915. How did he change? By 1915, Wilson had changed from what he campaigned for in 1912. He wanted to set strict rules for companies to prevent power abuse, but he left antitrust legislation flexible and created the FTC. Felt that social legislation was paternalistic and against American ideals, but he supported federal child labor laws, 8-hour work day for railroad workers, and interest credit for farmers. His whole idea of New Freedom was to have business free from government intervention. But by 1915, he was pretty active in expanding the federal government. Significance of progressivism. Brought power back to the executive branch. The period before this was lots of passive presidents that didn't do much. Government was brought back into American life. The period of laissez-faire government was before this, not anymore. Laid the groundwork for future social and economic legislation, and the whole purpose of the progressive era was to fix many problems in politics, life, society, government, and workplace. In a lot of cases they did, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And at the end of all my videos, I give a shout out to 2 special people, and those special people are Emma Payrote and Susan Tran. Okay, that's it. Peace out.